Whether a business should be run for short term results or with a focus on the long term is likewise a question of values. Financial analysts believe that businesses can be run for both simultaneously. Successful business people know better. To be sure, every company has to produce short term results, but in any conflict between short term results and long term growth, each company will determine its own priority. This is not primarily a disagreement about economics, it is fundamentally a value conflict regarding the function of a business and the responsibility of management. Value conflicts are not limited to business organizations. One of the fastest growing pastoral churches in the United States measures success by the number of new parishioners. Its leadership believes that what matters is how many newcomers join the congregation. The good Lord will then minister to their spiritual needs, or at least to the needs of a sufficient percentage. Another pastoral evangelical church believes that what matters is people's spiritual growth. The church eases out newcomers who join but do not enter into its spiritual life. Again, this is not a matter of numbers. At first glance, it appears that the second church grows more slowly, but it retains a far larger proportion of newcomers than the first one does. Its growth, in other words, is more solid. This is also not a theological problem, or only secondarily so. It is a problem about values. In a public debate, one pastor argued, "Unless you first come to church, you will never find the gate to the kingdom of heaven." "No," answered the other, "until you first look for the gate to the kingdom of heaven, you don't belong in church." Organizations, like people, have values. To be effective in an organization, a person's values must be compatible with the organization's values. They do not need to be the same, but they must be close enough to coexist. Otherwise, the person will not only be frustrated, but also will not produce results. A person's strengths and the way that person performs rarely conflict. The two are complementary. But there is sometimes a conflict between a person's values and his or her strengths. What one does well, even very well and successfully, may not fit with one's value system. In that case, the work may not appear to be worth devoting one's life to, or even a substantial portion thereof. If I may, allow me to interject a personal note. Many years ago, I too had to decide between my values and what I was doing successfully. I was doing very well as a young investment banker in London in the mid 1930s, and the work clearly fit my strengths. Yet, I did not see myself making a contribution as an asset manager. People, I realized, were what I valued, and I saw no point in being the richest man in the cemetery. I had no money and no other job prospects. Despite the continuing depression, I quit, and it was the right thing to do. Values, in other words, are and should be the ultimate test. Where do I belong? A small number of people know very early where they belong. Mathematicians, musicians, and cooks, for instance, are usually mathematicians, musicians, and cooks by the time they are 4 or 5 years old. Physicians usually decide on their careers in their teens, if not earlier. But most people, especially highly gifted people, do not really know where they belong until they are well past their mid 20s. By that time, however, they should know the answers to the three questions: what are my strengths? How do I perform? And what are my values? And then they can and should decide where they belong. Or rather, this is very important actually here. So I'm gonna highlight here. Or rather, they should be able to decide where they do not belong. Hmm, the process of elimination. This is what I have been thinking about recently a lot. The person who has learned that he or she does not perform well in a big organization should have learned to say no to a position in one. The person who has learned that he or she is not a decision maker should have learned to say no to a decision making assignment. A general Patton, who probably never learned this himself, should have learned to say no to an independent command. Equally important, knowing the answer to these questions enables a person to say to an opportunity, an offer, or an assignment, yes, I will do that, but this is the way I should be doing it. This is the way it should be structured. This is the way the relationships should be. These are the kind of results you should expect from me. And in this time frame, because this is who I am. Successful careers are not planned. They develop when people are prepared for opportunities because they know their strengths, their method of work, and their values. Knowing where one belongs can transform an ordinary person, hardworking and competent, but otherwise mediocre, into an outstanding performer. Wow. From a hardworking, from a hard, from a hardworking and competent but otherwise mediocre into an outstanding performer. What should I contribute? Throughout history, the great majority of people never had to ask the question, what should I contribute? They were told what to contribute. And their tasks were dictated either by the work itself, as it was for the peasant or artisan, or by a master or a mistress, as it was for domestic servants. And until very recently, it was taken for granted that most people were subordinates who did as they were told. Even in the 1950s and 1960s, the new knowledge workers, the so called organization men, looked to their company's personnel department to plan their careers. Then in the late 1960s, no one wanted to be told what to do any longer. Young men and women began to ask, what do I want to do? And what they heard was that the way to contribute was to do your own thing. But this solution was as wrong as the organization men's had been. Very few of the people who believed that doing one's own thing would lead to contribution, self fulfillment, and success achieved any of the three. But still, there is no return to the old answer of doing what you are told or assigned to do. Knowledge workers, in particular, have to learn to ask a question that has not been asked before. What should my contribution be? To answer it, they must address three distinct elements. What does the situation require? Given my strengths, my way of performing, and my values, how can I make the greatest contribution to what needs to be done? And finally, what results have to be achieved to make a difference? Consider the experience of a newly appointed hospital administrator. The hospital was big and prestigious, but it had been coasting on its reputation for 30 years. The new administrator decided that his contribution should be to establish a standard of excellence in one important area within 2 years. He chose to focus on the emergency room, which was big, visible, and sloppy. He decided that every patient who came into the ER had to be seen by a qualified nurse within 60 seconds. Within 12 months, the hospital's emergency room had become a model for all hospitals in the United States, and within another 2 years, the whole hospital had been transformed. As this example suggests, it is rarely possible or even particularly fruitful to look too far ahead. A plan can usually cover no more than 18 months and still be reasonably clear and specific. So the question in most cases should be where and how can I achieve results that will make a difference within the next year and a half? The answer must balance several things. First, the results should be hard to achieve. They should require stretching, to use the current buzzword, but also they should be within a reach. To aim at results that cannot be achieved or that can be only under the most unlikely circumstances is not being ambitious, it is being foolish. Second, the results should be meaningful, they should make a difference. Finally, results should be visible and, if at all possible, measurable. From this will come a course of action, what to do, where and how to start, and what goals and deadlines to set. Responsibility for relationships. So let's mark these three sections, right? First, the results should be hard to achieve. Second, the results should be meaningful. They should make a difference. And finally, results should be visible and measurable. And then you have what to do, where and how to start, and what goals and deadlines to set. Very few people work by themselves and achieve results by themselves. A few great artists, a few great scientists, a few great athletes. Most people work with others and are effective with other people. That is true whether they are members of an organization or independently employed. Managing yourself requires taking responsibility for relationships. This has two parts. The first is to accept the fact that other people are as much individuals as yourself are. They perversely insist on behaving like human beings. This means that they too have their strengths, they too have their ways of getting things done, they too have their values. To be effective, therefore, you have to know the strengths, the performance modes, and the values of your coworkers. That sounds obvious, but few people pay attention to it. Typical is the person who was trained to write reports in his or her first assignment because that boss was a reader. Even if the next boss is a listener, the person goes on writing reports that invariably produce no results. Invariably, the boss will think the employee is stupid, incompetent, and lazy, and he or she will fail. But that could have been avoided if the employee had only looked at the new boss and analyzed how this boss performs. Bosses are neither a title on the organization chart nor a function. They are individuals and are entitled to do their work in the way they do it best. It is incumbent on the people who work with them to observe them, to find out how they work, and to adapt themselves to what makes their bosses most effective. This, in fact, is the secret of managing the boss. The same holds true for all your coworkers. Each works his or her way, not your way, and each is entitled to work in his or her way. What matters is whether they perform and what their values are. As for how they perform, each is likely to do it differently. The first secret of effectiveness is to understand the people you work with and depend on so that you can make use of their strengths, their ways of working, and their values. Working relationships are as much based on the people as they are on the work. The second part of relationship responsibility is taking responsibility for communication. Whether Whenever I or any other consultant start to work with an organization, the first thing I hear about are all the personality conflicts. Most of these arise from the fact that people do not know that other people are doing and how what other people are doing and how they do their work, or what contribution the other people are concentrating on and what results they expect. And the reason they do not know is that they have not asked and therefore have not been told. This failure to ask reflects human stupidity less than it reflects human history. Until recently, it was unnecessary to tell any of these things to anybody. In a medieval city, everyone in a district piled the same trade. In the countryside, everyone in a valley planted the same crop as soon as the frost was out of the ground. Even those few people who did things that were not common worked alone, so they did not have to tell anyone what they were doing. Today, the great majority of people work with others who have different tasks and responsibilities. The marketing vice president may have come out of sales and know everything about sales, but she knows nothing about the things she has never done: pricing, advertising, packaging, and the like. So the people who do these things must make sure that the marketing vice president understands what they are trying to do, why they are trying to do it, and how they are going to do it, and what results to expect. So you have to understand what your boss is trying to do, why they are doing it, how they are going to do it, and what results they want at the end. If the marketing vice president does not understand what these high grade knowledge specialists are doing, it is primarily their fault, not hers. They have not educated her. Conversely, so if your boss does not understand what you as a high grade knowledge specialist are doing, is primarily like your fault, not the boss's fault, not the vice president's. You as the knowledge specialist have not educated her, your boss. Conversely, it is the marketing vice president's responsibility to make sure that all of her coworkers understand how she looks at marketing, what her goals are, how she works, and what she expects of herself and of each one of them. Even people who understand the importance of taking responsibility for relationships often do not communicate sufficiently with their associates. They are afraid of being thought presumptuous or inquisitive or stupid. They are wrong whenever someone goes to his or her associates and says, "This is what I'm good at, this is how I work, these are my values, this is the contribution I plan to concentrate on, and the results I should be expected to deliver." The response is always, "This is most helpful, but why didn't you tell me earlier?" And one gets the same reaction without exception, in my experience, if one continues by asking, "And what do I need to know about your strengths, how you perform, your values, and your proposed contribution?" In fact, knowledge workers should request this of everyone with whom they work, whether as subordinate, superior, colleague, or team member. And again, whenever this is done, the reaction is always, "Thanks for asking me, but why didn't you ask me earlier?" Organizations are no longer built on force, but on trust. The experience, the existence of trust between people does not necessarily mean that they like one another. It means that they understand one another. Taking responsibility for relationships is therefore an absolute necessity. It is a duty. Whether one is a member of the organization, a consultant to it, a supplier, or a distributor, one owes that responsibility to all one's co-worker, those whose work one depends on, as well as those who depend on one's own work. The second half of your life. When work for most people meant manual labor, there was no need to worry about the second half of your life. You simply kept on doing what you had always done, and if you were lucky enough to survive 40 years of hard work in the mill or on the railroad, you were quite happy to spend the rest of your life doing nothing. Today, however, most work is knowledge work, and knowledge workers are not finished after 40 years on their job. They are merely bored. Jeez. We hear a great deal of talk about the midlife crisis of the executive. It is mostly boredom. At 45, most executives have reached the peak of their business careers, and they know it. After 20 years of doing very much the same kind of work, they are very good at their jobs, but they are not learning or contributing or deriving challenges and satisfaction from the job, and yet they are still likely to face another 20, if not 25 years of work. That is why managing oneself increasingly leads one to begin a second career. There are three ways to develop a second career. The first is actually to start one. Often this takes nothing more than so starting your own second career often takes nothing more than moving from one kind of organization to another. The divisional controller in a large corporation, for instance, becomes the controller of a medium sized hospital. But there are also growing numbers of people who move into different lines of work altogether. The business executive or government official who enters the ministry at 45, for instance, or the mid level manager who leaves corporate life after 20 years to attend law school and become a small town attorney. We will see many more second careers undertaken by people who have achieved modest success in their first jobs. Such people have substantial skills and they know how to work. They need a community. The house is empty with the children gone, and they need income as well. But above all, they need challenge. The second way to prepare for the second half of your life is to develop a parallel career. Many people who are very successful in their first careers stay in the work they have been doing either on a full time or part time or consulting basis. But in addition, they create a parallel job, usually in a non-profit organization. That takes another 10 hours of work a week. They might take over the administration of their church, for instance, or the presidency of the local Girl Scouts Council. They might run the battered women's shelter, work as a children's librarian for the local public library, sit on the school board, and so on. Finally, there are the social entrepreneurs. These are usually people who have been very successful in their first careers. They love their work, but it no longer challenges them. In many cases, they keep on doing what they have been doing all along but spend less and less of their time on it. They also start another activity, usually a non-profit. My friend Buford, Bob Buford, for example, built a very successful television company that he still runs, but he has also founded and built a successful nonprofit organization that works with Protestant churches, and he is building another to teach social entrepreneurs how to manage their own nonprofit ventures while still running their original businesses. Okay, my personal thought on nonprofit organizations, NGOs, is that they are basically useless. In principle, they are. It doesn't make sense. Okay, why? Because how we bring prosperity to everyone's life, to every human being's life, is by advancing and evolving and surpassing the roof, just taking the roof higher and higher. For example, going to space. Nowadays, you see everyone talking about going to Mars, going to the moon, stuff like that. So that mentality is needed for making more money and prosperity and advancing in technology. And if you compare our lives to 50, 100, 1,000 years ago, you'll see all these technological differences that we have nowadays: cars, airplanes, things that enable us to move faster and give us super abilities, right? So NGOs don't make sense in that area, because NGO is just like giving free food to your friend, but for that food to be uh, for you to be able to eat that food, you need to process it. You need to do some editing on it, and that enables you and your friend and everyone to be able to eat that food, right? Otherwise, it would not be eatable. For example, this is why agriculture happened, and so on. Okay, let's get back to the book. People who manage the second half of their lives may always be a minority. The majority may retire on the job and count the years until their actual retirement. But it is this minority, the men and women who see a long working life expectancy, as an opportunity both for themselves and for society, who will become leaders and models. So he's saying that minority of those, like those very successful in their careers, first careers, um, you'll see them as a minority who can manage their second half of life. But the majority would be retiring on their jobs and count the years until their actual retirement. They're just retired in the head, and they the actual retirement for them takes place when they're 80, right? But it is this minority, the men and women who see a long working life expectancy. So they see a long working life expectancy as an opportunity both for themselves and for society, who will become leaders and models. This is good. This is honestly good. There is one prerequisite for managing the second half of your life. You must begin long before you enter it. When it first became clear 30 years ago that working life expectancies were lengthening very fast, many observers, including myself, believed that retired people would increasingly become volunteers for non-profit institutions. That has not happened. If one does not begin to volunteer before one is 40 or so, one will not volunteer once past 60. Similarly, all the social entrepreneurs I know began to work in their chosen second enterprise long before they reached their peak in their original business. Consider the example of a successful lawyer, the legal counsel to a large corporation, who has started a venture to establish model schools in his state. He began to do volunteer legal work for the schools when he was around 35. He was elected to the school board at age 40. At age 50, when he had amassed a fortune, he started his own enterprise to build and to run model schools. He is, however, still working nearly full time as the lead counsel in the company he helped found as a young lawyer. There is another reason to develop a second major interest, and to develop it early. No one can expect to live very long without experiencing a serious setback in his or her life or work. You can't expect to live very long without experiencing a setback, a serious setback. There is the competent engineer who is passed over for promotion at age 45. There is the competent college professor who realizes at age 42 that she will never get a professorship at a big university, even though she may be fully qualified for it. There are tragedies in one's family life, the breakup of one's marriage, or the loss of a child. At such times, a second major interest, not just a hobby, may make all the difference. The engineer, for example, now knows that he has not been very successful in his job. But in his outside activity, as church treasurer, for example, he is a success. One's family may break up, but in that outside activity, there is still a community. In a society in which success has become so terribly important, having options will become increasingly vital. Historically, there was no such thing as success. The overwhelming majority of people did not expect anything but to stay in their proper station. As an old English prayer has it, the only mobility was downward mobility. In a knowledge society, however, we expect everyone to be a success. This is clearly an impossibility. For a great many people, there is at best an absence of failure. Wherever there is success, there has to be failure. And then it is vitally important for the individual and equally for the individual's family to have an area in which he or she can contribute, make a difference, and be somebody. That means finding a second area, whether in a second career, a parallel career, or a social venture, that offers an opportunity for being a leader, for being respected, for being a success. The challenges of managing oneself may seem obvious, if not elementary, and the answers may seem self evident to the point of appearing naive. But managing oneself requires new and unprecedented things from the individual, and especially from the knowledge worker. In effect, managing oneself demands that each knowledge worker think and behave like a chief executive officer. Further, the shift from manual workers who do as they are told to knowledge workers who have to manage themselves profoundly challenges social structure. Every existing society, even the most individualistic one, takes two things for granted, if only subconsciously: that organizations outlive workers and that most people stay put. Again, every existing society, even the most individualistic one, like the West, takes two things for granted, if only subconsciously: that organizations outlive workers and most people stay put. Staying put means that they're laid down, like they don't achieve the success that they are uh, gazing towards, the success that they have their eyes on, right? But today the opposite is true. Wow. Knowledge workers just gives you hope, no? Knowledge workers outlive organizations and they are mobile. The need to manage oneself is therefore creating a revolution in human affairs. Nowadays, knowledge workers outlive organizations and they are mobile. Let me mark that in color blue. The need to manage oneself is therefore creating a revolution in human affairs. So, creating a revolution in human affairs brings you the need to manage yourself. Tell me what you think about these 20 or so pages that Peter Drucker, who was a writer, teacher, and consultant, uh, tell me what you think about it. His 34 books have been published in more than 70 languages, and he founded the Drucker Foundation for Non-Profit Management and counseled 13 governments, public services, institutions, and major corporations. the coming of new organization, the discipline of innovation, the effective decision, how to make people decisions, managing for business effectiveness, new templates for today's organizations, the theory of the business, they're not employees, they're people, what makes an effective executive. Cool, cool. There's also the first half of the book that I have not read out loud, but I'll definitely share that with you. Okay, for now, peace.